Thank you, Professor Anders Runesson, for coming, taking the time to be with us. Professor Runesson is currently Dean and Professor of the New Testament at the University of Oslo, Norway. He has been visiting professor at the Institute of Archaeology at Hebrew University, and from 2003 to 2015, he was blessed to be in Canada. Professor of New Testament in the Department of Religious Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, about 30 minutes from where I was born. He has a keen interest in interreligious relations and the relationship between society and academia, which is really exactly what we're talking about these days. He is also an ordained pastor of the Church of Sweden, Lutheran, and therefore is very interested in the relationship between theology and church life and contemporary religious dialogue, exactly where we're trying to reach. His research includes studies on the Jewish and Christian origins and the early synagogue, such as those who were there at Ostiantica yesterday heard him commenting with the other archaeologists on the question of that synagogue. He is author or editor of 14 books and over 80 peer-reviewed articles. He has focused as well some of his research, his dissertation work, and later work on the origins of the synagogue, a very, very interesting question, especially pre-70, post-70. We've heard here Carol and Eric Myers debate that. His recent works include Divine Wrath and Salvation in Matthew, that is available in JSTOR for download. And another, Judaism for Gentiles, Reading Paul Beyond the Parting of the Ways paradigm, and that is open access if you want to grab that book, so it's free. Thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing your insights, new perspectives on methodological perspective within Judaism. To you, then, Anders.
Thank you very much for that generous invitation. I'm very happy and humbled to be here. I've just noted that you have a fantastic way of inclusion. So you have Jewish participants, you have even Lutherans here. So, even Canadians. And so it's very impressive. Although I should say that the Swedish Lutheran Church is probably the most Catholic of all the Lutheran churches. So there you go. You might hear that in the talk. Let's see. Yes, I am. All right, so Jesus the Jew, yes, but how? So this talk will be a little bit about within Judaism, but beyond rabbis and Christians. So looking at history and then some hermeneutics and what we can think about normativity towards the end. So for more than a millennium and a half, with few exceptions, Jesus has preached Christianity in churches. Indeed, when Christians architecturalized Jesus in late antiquity, merging the gospel texts with the landscapes of Judea and Galilee, mapping and constructing sacred Christian heritage, they built churches, not synagogues, to commemorate and worship their Messiah. And here we have pictures from the Franciscan excavations. With a slightly longer history, but still, it was not until the arrival of modern historical criticism and the development of the field of archaeology in the 19th century that Christian scholars refocused their attention to Jewish sites and artifacts, beginning to model a historical Jesus in his Jewish setting. And here I have one of the pictures here is from the Franciscans, and the other is my own on the white limestone synagogue. That, as you know, is from the 5th and 6th century, but when it was discovered, people said, the archaeologists said, this is the synagogue where Jesus preached in Capernaum. So the interest and the focus there is important to note. These developments, I think, had their epistemological origins in the Enlightenment and the changing ways of knowing that emerged in its wake. All of these have contributed to landing us where we are now, where we not only search for the Jewish Jesus, but also value such knowledge historically and theologically. For since the Enlightenment, it has become increasingly clear that theology is not history, and importantly, history is not theology. Historical study is the study of the other, the one who is not us, so that the art of doing history is necessarily intertwined with the task of defamiliarization. In other words, when we seek the historical Jesus, we seek not the one who is worshipped in churches, but someone whose normative relevance to us today is not immediately apparent, but has to be hermeneutically considered. And this is a big part of the paper. As Albert Schweitzer and John P. Meyer and many others have repeatedly noted, here in Meyer's words, and I quote, "The more we appreciate what Jesus meant in his own time and place, the more alien he will seem to us." End of quote. History, then, is perhaps best understood as a countercultural project, which challenges any easy genealogies between us and the historical them. The past, as we reconstruct it, cannot in itself bind us to certain normative positions, since the normative always resides in the present. But what it can do is to challenge the sense of certainty that we may have in relation to what we think we know that we know. The past can destabilize our sense of being the enlightened end goal of history and just force us to accept that, contrary to popular belief, we are not the center of the world. In this way, at the very least, our understanding or our self-understanding and ability to project and choose our future is entirely dependent on us understanding our past. And this, I think, comes with some implications as we engage in theological work. We shall return to possible relationships between history and theology, the past and the present. What I wanted to flag here at the beginning is that historical study does not give us a pass on theological reflection, the latter being a much more complex task than the former, as we all know. Considering then the Jesus of history, a Galilean Jew, before we engage in the issues of his theological significance or relevance for Jewish-Christian dialogue, we must state the obvious. No serious scholar today doubts that Jesus was a Jew, that he, as an individual, belonged within and identified with the Jewish people. Jesus was, in this sense, within Judaism. But the real question is perhaps not a question requiring only a yes or no answer, but rather, what kind of Jew was he? What did he want? And importantly, how do we know this? It is this last question that I believe leads us further into historical issues that open up new theological challenges. For when we ask the how question, our search for historical evidence to make our case forces us right into the hands of the canonical Gospels. Sure, there are other source materials that can and should be accessed, forming like concentric circles, as it were, around the Gospels. Geography, topography, inscriptions, archaeology, and some scattered sayings of Jesus reported in later texts. But all of that provides us mostly with indirect evidence. The only direct evidence offering us portraits of Jesus is still, after centuries of research and wishful thinking, the canonical Gospels. This means, of course, that any reconstruction of a Jewish Jesus rests primarily on the material that the Gospels provide us with. What does this mean for our understanding of the nature and identity of those same New Testament texts? Is it possible to discover a historical Jewish Jesus through non-Jewish texts? And what kind of methodology would we apply to achieve such a reconstruction? Or is our appreciation of Jesus as a first-century Jew rather dependent on the identification of the texts themselves about him as also being Jewish, as being within Judaism? This question leads us right into current scholarly debates, which some, myself included, believe may lead us into a historical paradigm shift in how we understand the New Testament, not as a collection of texts, of course. The New Testament canon is a Christian idea and Christian product, but as individual texts. Here, the claim emerging from New Testament scholars, working along the lines of what is now called the within Judaism perspective, can be explained something like the following. For most readers of the Christian Bible, it is a given that its inclusion of the Old Testament, if we use that term, does not transform Leviticus, Isaiah, or Amos into Christian texts. Their canonization in the church has resulted in Christian readings of them, yes, but historically everyone agrees that these texts belong among the literary treasures of ancient Israel. They were not originally produced by or for Christians. Christian canonization and use of these texts thus belong to their reception history, not their inception history. Now, within Judaism scholars on the New Testament, they are from a variety of backgrounds. They are now arguing that the same is true for the texts included in the New Testament. While the canonization of these texts within the Christian church certainly was a Christian project, resulting in Christian readings of Matthew, Mark, Acts, Paul, and these scholars suggest that historically they too belong among the literary treasures of the Jewish people. Christian canonization and use of these texts thus belong to their reception history, not their inception history. Now, if this is true historically, what would this mean for those preaching these texts every Sunday? What would it mean for the church? And what would it mean for Jewish-Christian relations and dialogue? Answers to these questions are complex and difficult to disentangle from traditional perspectives, but that does not make them less important or urgent. To approach such problems, we need to first discuss some definitions and other preliminaries in order to see things clear in context, in historical context and in contemporary context. So, within Judaism, beyond rabbis and Christians. So, beginning with the obvious, all questions we ask take as point of departure the world in which we ourselves live. Its religious, social contours, its cultural and political fabric. First century Judaism, including its messianic forms, is not part of any of this. No one today, a follower of Jesus or not, can live a first century Jewish life, quite simply because no one can enter the same river twice. This means that, strictly speaking, reading Paul or Matthew or Mark or John within Judaism today means reading these texts as in some way hermeneutically effective within a reading collective identifying as Jewish in ways that differ from what we see in the New Testament. This is because the vast majority of people identifying as Jewish today engage in canonical reading practices defined by Rabbinic Judaism, a form of Judaism that did not exist when these texts, the New Testament texts, were authored, and which evolved beyond their normative reach. For most Jews today, then, reading Paul and the Gospels within Judaism would be an anomaly, an exercise in hermeneutical asymmetry. The irony is, of course, that rather soon after the New Testament texts were produced, their normative reach came to include non-Jews who identified precisely as such and made a theological point about doing so, and who therefore constitute the primary lineage for the present-day Christians. Reading Paul, Matthew, and the others within Judaism is therefore also for most Christians an exercise in hermeneutical asymmetry. Now, asking why this is so may lead us in two directions. First, Judaism for both groups, contemporary groups, means not Christianity. Secondly, historically, these New Testament texts have a solid reception history as tools for denouncing that which is not Christianity, and especially Judaism, and we heard AJ talk about this before. And Judaism then is almost always understood, like Christianity, as an unchanging and monolithic entity from the first century until today. In order to understand texts included in the New Testament as Jewish, we need to remove both Rabbinic Judaism and mainstream Christianity from the historical archive, or our lens for that archive, and focus our attention on a time and place where none of these phenomena existed. Taking contextual plausibility as our starting point for understanding the first century, what is striking, first of all, is the existence of the enormous variety of ways in which Jews understood and practiced their ancestral customs and tradition. Joseph talked about this yesterday too. All of which have since disappeared from the scene of history or been partly absorbed by other forms of Judaism. It is the rediscovery, I think, of this diversity more than anything else that has opened up for understanding not only Jesus and the movement around him, but also the texts that the movement left behind as examples of this Jewish variety or Jewish diversity. For scholars working from a within Judaism perspective, it would thus be historically more correct to refer to the New Testament text as examples of Judaism rather than referring to Judaism as a background against which to measure the newness or otherness of these Christ groups and texts, as have often been done in the past. In terms of method or approach, aiming to understand the Jesus movement and their texts in the context of a pluriform first-century Judaism, several scholars have suggested that we should identify first a set of ideas or practices that are essential to recognize something as within or outside Judaism. And most famously, James Dunn, a professor of New Testament in Britain, proposed what he called the 4 pillars of Judaism: monotheism, election and land, Torah, and temple. Now, the problem is, though, that while such comparative approaches may seem valid at first, they do not respond, I think, to the nature of the source material, which is pluriform, fluid, and adjustable within the context of ancestral customs oriented around the God of Israel. For this time period, despite significant overlaps in practices, the evidence simply lacks a normative center that we as observers could identify as accepted by all Jews. And this raises the question of how we would be able at all to decide what a first-century Jew, self-identifying as a Jew, could or could not think or do. If first-century Judaism was a diverse phenomenon, and if we consider the fact that what has often been understood as the most authentic form of Judaism, which is usually and anachronistically a form of rabbinic Judaism, in reality was just one variant among many variants, in fact, even sometimes a minority position. Against what should we measure the Gospels or Paul in order to understand their relationship to the category Judaism? And this question, in turn, leads us to a more general issue, which is observable across many related disciplines. Why is it? That little pause was to just mark how important the following sentence is. Why is it, when we do research, that we often seem to need an archetypal or most authentic something against which to compare what then necessarily becomes a deviation? What are the methodological considerations behind such interpretive decisions? So, I think we need to change the way we ask questions. What, for example, would the outcome be if we instead asked the following questions? And these are just suggestions, there are many more. Which ancestral customs, traditions, and texts do Paul and the Gospel refer to as self-evidently authoritative when they construe the arguments that they expect their readers to be convinced by? Who else among Paul's, Matthew's, Mark's, and John's contemporaries in the Mediterranean world referred to the same customs and texts as authoritative when they aimed at convincing their audiences? Which ancestral customs are considered to work against God's plans for Paul's addressees, for example, the nations, and crucially, again a little pause, which traditions are used to make that specific case? Which ancestral traditions and customs in the Mediterranean world nurtured ideas about an anointed king to rule Israel and the nations, treated as two entities, one specific and the other general? What does Paul's self-identification as an apostle to the nations imply about his self-understanding of the ethnic composition of the world and his own current location within that composition? Now, if Paul and the others had to identify their God or the God of whom they spoke, what would they have called that God? That's not always mentioned, but Matthew mentions it explicitly and calls that God the God of Israel. I think such questions seem to me to open up for consideration the nature of the wider discursive context within which Paul and the others formulated and communicated their messages, simultaneously and then indirectly indicating which other Greco-Roman ancestral customs, traditions, and texts of which they, and from their perspective, their audiences had no use. So my point is this. The answers to questions such as these allow us to construct the general outlines of and name a category within which Paul and the others define themselves, and which they understand to contain the rhetorical force needed to convince their audiences. This may be done then without having to posit a set of criteria isolating an entity which itself is fluid and adjustable, or drawing up a methodologically ambiguous and arbitrarily selected ideal image of an authentic or fixed category against which to compare the content of the letters and the gospel. Or, again, to put it differently, the multiple variations of the ancestral customs we designate as first-century Judaism are expressions of a recognizable theme, but there is no original, authentic, ideal, fixed, pure, or universally accepted authoritative melody on which variations elaborate. There is no starting point. We only have the variations of an ethno-religious discourse and its related practices. Now, a final point on that. Paul presents us with a special problem, as we all know, as his addressees are non-Jews, and he wants them to remain so even as they accept his in Christ vision, back when Christianity was not yet a thing. I failed to find clues in his letters, though, that would suggest that Paul aimed to create a third entity beyond Jews and Gentiles with the intention of reenacting an exodus for Jews, rescuing them, as it were, from their ancestral traditions and leading them into some Gentile promised land. Rather, the Jewish ancestral traditions are precisely what carries within them the salvific force now shared with non-Jews too. What Paul, the apostle to the nations, offers his addressees is then, I believe, best described as a particular form of Judaism for Gentiles, for those who are not Jewish like himself. For Paul, these Gentiles then are thought of as being under the umbrella, the larger umbrella of Judaism without being Jews. And this, I think, was an innovation within the Jesus movement. Such innovation, and it was not accepted by all, just to point that out clearly. Such innovation, however, does not make it non-Jewish or un-Jewish when seen in its pre-rabbinic first century context. All this begins to change as we enter the 2nd century and read for the first time the word Christianismos, a category specifically designed by Ignatius of Antioch. That pause was unintentional. By Ignatius of Antioch, using Judaismos as its opposite to define what it meant or means to be a Christian. So that was when this word Christianity is introduced for the first time, Judaismos or Judaism is used to say what it is not. And that, I think, is important. Here we have Ignatius up in St. Andrew-Beaupré in Canada. While the Pseudo-Clementine literature shows us that for centuries, such oppositional categorizations establishing an either-or between Judaism and Christianity were not acceptable to everyone, Ignatius' voice is one of the first signs of what would soon develop into the Church as it constructed its emerging identity based on it not being Jewish, not being Judaism, not being the synagogue, but rather replacing it all, applying the inherently destructive hermeneutical principle foreign to what we see in the Gospels and Paul, that the life of the one requires the demise of the other. And here I have a very unpleasant image. Let's see, that was Ignatius. I'm not really following through, that one. About the so-called, that you may have heard of, the living crosses that were found throughout Europe, and also up in Scandinavia, actually, without the swords and stuff, but still the same thing. This, I believe, is the fruit of that theological tree, and history has shown exactly where that might lead us. But since Nostra Aetate, such hermeneutics have been forcefully rejected, not only by the Roman Catholic Church, but also by many Protestant churches. Still, its own logic, its old logic, turns up in many sermons, writings, and indeed also in church art. Can history be mobilized to reveal other patterns of thought in the scriptures that the churches hold sacred? And if so, how can we redefine the possible in theology? That is the question. Choosing life, seeking the normative in teaching and theology and dialogue. The Church, especially after Nostra Aetate, has learned to handle the Jewish Jesus and found deep insight into itself, its nature, and its theology as a result. In addition, the dynamics of Jewish-Christian dialogue has changed in some very positive ways. But what if not only Jesus, but also the New Testament texts are best described historically as Jewish, as within Judaism, as we have suggested here? This is the hermeneutical challenge historical study of the New Testament places before theologians. Such a paradigm changes in our understanding of the text, however, which are argued by scholars from a wide variety of backgrounds, including Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, agnostic, and atheist, may have implications also beyond contemporary Christian communities. While some Christians may react with anxiety to a proposal that appeared to them to blur boundaries between religious communities, the same is also true for some Jews. In dialogue, we seek to understand the other, and through such hermeneutical processes, we may also see ourselves in new ways. Historical research, it is therefore important to note, is not and can never be normative. Historians can only add historical voices to whatever conversations into which they are invited. It is up to the religious communities and others taking part in such conversations to explore the meaning and value of such voices in their own meaning-making projects. Do we then overthrow the historical project and its place in the theological endeavor by such a claim? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold it. That was a reference to Paul. To the degree the historical has a place in or at the theological table, and I would suggest that it has, not least against the background of the late and ancient and medieval hermeneutics of the four senses of scriptures, where the literal, that is, the historical, we could say, understanding of the text is the first, and according to many theologians, such as Hugh of St. Victor, the most important to deal with first, before the other senses are addressed, to the degree that historical studies are called upon in theology, teaching, and homiletics, it would be important, I think, not to theologize it in isolation, but to seek the normative in the present across several revelatory loci. For as Ella Mouton has argued, the theological authority of the texts, and I quote, lies in their referential power, in their ability to point beyond themselves to an ultimate reality which they could only describe in limited and provisional ways. Such an approach to the theological authority of the biblical texts indeed resonates with what these writings themselves project, as the divine is sought and revealed in these texts both within and beyond the written word. An exclusive focus on text in theology would thus, just as a singular focus on history would, inevitably lead astray. And here the Catholic Church has, of course, been way ahead of the Lutherans for centuries. The first century is no more, though, as we may have noticed. A new world has emerged. But the lives of Jews and Christians are still intertwined in a variety of ways. The present, where the normative resides and opportunity lives, is that odd dynamic space in the tension between the past and the future, where choice emerges, not only as possible, but as inevitable. All theology depends on choice, and with choice follows accountability. We cannot transfer to others, people or texts, in history or in the present, what it is our responsibility to address. We need to carry our own hermeneutical burden and pay attention to the fruits of our theological trees. To echo Matthew 7:15-20. Let me quote that verse, slightly adapted to our topic, to highlight a key criterion, or maybe even Matthew's only criterion, for finding truth. I have it right here. Beware of false theologies, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, and the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus, you will know them by their fruits. But if we are responsible to carry our own hermeneutical burden, and our educational strategies need to reflect this. After Nostra Aetate, especially, education needs to be, I think, multidimensional and include the other in theory and practice, as this conference is a very good example of. Educational contexts isolated from the other, as history has shown, struggle to carry the collective ethical self over the abyss of stereotyping, polarization, and enmity. Theological studies generally, and teaching of the Bible specifically, should involve dialogue with those who are affected by our readings of these texts, whether it is the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. We become who we are also as readers, in our encounters with the other, historical and contemporary. So, in conclusion, as we mobilize the past, seeking insight into the Church's Holy Scripture, should Jesus the Jew preach Judaism in churches in the 21st century then? What else could a Jewish Jesus do, especially if we learn about him through texts also considered in terms of their inception history Jewish? Of course not. This is not the point of historical research on Jesus or the New Testament texts. But neither Jesus nor the New Testament text can preach Christianity either, because none of them even knew the term Christianismos. Only the Church can preach Christianity. This is the Church's unique calling. Whenever the texts of the New Testament are read in seminaries and in services, however, or Jesus is referred to, Judaism becomes necessarily an integral part of what the Church teaches and preaches. Historical understanding of Jesus and the New Testament text suggests, therefore, that we seek to embody a hermeneutical awareness steeped in humility when we engage Jesus' Judaism and mold Christian theology, remembering with Paul that regardless of the Christ event, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Romans 11:29. And if in interpretive doubt in our teaching about the Church and about the other, whether the other is in the room or not, we can always, and should, I think, seek hermeneutical guidance based on the words of Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, where Moses says, "I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Therefore, choose life." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that stimulating reflection on dealing with these methodological issues and the problems of trying to get at this historical figure. So we are gathered here together now at the end of our time together, and as perhaps it's the most important reflection. We've heard very good academic talks, we've had pastoral talks, we've listened to discussions of how someone like Joseph and others have tried to incorporate this material into their teaching in their courses. And the question now really is, where do we go from here? What is the future of this kind of discussion, and how do we move it forward? And everyone in the room, I suspect, has a thought on that question. So, so I'm going to pass the word to the four of our panelists and let them kind of respond to this question of, having heard all of that we're about, how do we move it out of this aula into teaching, university, and wherever they want to lead us. So Massimo, to you.
Thank you. But first of all, let me say that Craig and I are very satisfied with this conference, and thank you, Craig, for working together on that. Thank you to our speakers that were not only so inspiring in their talks, but also so friendly, and I think it is not less important. And of course, thank you all for being here, so many every day. We are very happy about that. And I'm only working on a few slides, focusing mostly on this university. And starting from some data that are not really updated, but not that old. Who are our students? When we say our, we mean the Collegium Maximum, that is this mission inside the Gregorian University. As you can see, most of our students are priests from dioceses or religious priests, seminarians, consecrated, and then 20%, about 20% of lay people. And it is what you can see if you go out of this room, for example, lunchtime or in the break during the classes. And where do our students come from? So Europe is about 40%. Then we have what we call Americas, it's 22%, Asia, 18%, Africa, 17%, and then of course less from Oceania. So this is the picture as it stands now. And I think that in the future, the percentage of European students or students from North America will not increase, but the other way around, there will be less. So why am I saying all of this? And I'm going to conclude to leave room to the discussion and to your questions. This is about, I took it from a book of Sergio Della Pergola, and it is from 2019, so again, not that updated, but not that old. And the 20 largest core Jewish populations. And why am I doing this? To show one point that I think in these universities, but I would say in the Christian world, we need to take into account that most of our students, or more of our students, are increasingly coming from places where they will meet no Jewish people at all in their life. And it is already happening. We have some students at the Bear Center, for example, who met the first Jew in their life when they meet Rabbi David Meyer. So what does it mean about Jewish-Christian dialogue? That it can become a dialogue between real Christians and scriptural Jews, as somehow it was with the Church Fathers. And we go back to something that has been said this morning or during the other talks, but I'm referring mostly to AJ talk earlier. How do we preach that? How do we use lectionary if the meeting that we have with Jews is not a meeting with real Jews, but Jews that we picture from Scripture? So I think it asks ourselves to be more aware of this, to read the text according to what has been suggested during this conference and in other occasions like that. Otherwise, the risk that we are running is to go to some stereotypes like stubborn that was mentioned and so on. The best would be to have real occasions of meeting between people. But if you cannot do that, let's work together. For example, just one practical suggestion. We have now books about Jewish reading of New Testament. Why don't we think about Jewish commentaries on the lectionary until we cannot really change the lectionaries? I would stop here.
Oh, thank you. I would react to that, but I don't want to. I want to let AJ speak. That's more important.
Going to
Yeah, you're on.
going to church should not be 50
Thank you,
minutes, do
Robert.
the Mass, and you're done. There should also be some Bible study associated with it. I think that's Protestants have managed to do this. You all could as well. So better education. I want protection from anti-Semitic material, prophylaxis from anti-Semitic material, so that when we have unfortunate statements coming up from the Vatican, somebody ought to be there, because it's not just a speechwriter, it's whoever's setting the type, and somebody should be watching for this stuff. And I think that would be helpful. iTrail, L'Osservatore Romano, Donny Chiesa Mundo. I'm on the editorial board. And I've got my fellow editors for Women Church World, which is the Women's Vatican magazine. So I've got my editors more or less attuned to the problems, because twice I've threatened to quit. America Magazine, National Catholic Reporter in the Vatican. I also troll Protestant materials. Where are the gatekeepers? Why is it that some people are just continuing to publish nonsense week after week, and when they're told they still do it? That's a sin. If you're told once, you know. If you do it twice, it's on you. So protection for publication. In terms of Jewish commentary on the lectionary, there are some. The Heschel Center at the Catholic University of Lublin, Poland, has been having Jewish commentaries on lectionary readings for the past, I think, 4 years, because I do one about every month. And this year they decided, instead of having commentaries on the gospel text, where it would be important, they just want commentaries on the Psalms. So they had a wonderful system. The commentaries are available in Polish and a number of other languages. They are on the website for the Catholic Biblical Association of America, so it's available, but they've stopped doing that. So if we cannot change the lectionary, which would be the better move, to continue to have those, and they're only 5 minutes, to continue to have those Jewish commentaries, can prevent a lot of bad sermons.
Hey, so thank you, AJ. I think you're assigning all of us here in this room that task, to follow up with to learn to have these new eyes that you've taught me to see with new eyes, to say, okay, no, that needs to be called out, and not make them feel guilty. Yeah. But say, this is a growth. We're all learning this together. So yeah, so I think one of the things, we're all of the convinced in this room, but now we see the task at hand. Please, Adele.
Just to build on what others have already said, I've been thinking about the role of Nostra Aetate at this conference and in general in all of these tasks. And Nostra Aetate, I think in some ways, it's not a perfect statement, but it calls for action against anti-Judaism, against anti-Semitism. But I have yet to see that that's really been put into practice, and to think out the implications of that. So how do you? It's not enough to simply say, well, Jews of all time are not responsible for the death of Jesus, but how does that then play out in terms of how certain passages are preached and what children are taught? So along those lines, I think, again, just building on what has already been said, that some of the thought structures that are present in Christian teaching and preaching are so deeply ingrained that the people who use them and the people who hear them don't recognize them as anti-Jewish. The tendency to play Jesus off against his background instead of seeing Jesus as part of a community where he was doing things the same as other people did them in his community. That desire to focus Jesus' uniqueness in contrast to Judaism, I think it's deeply ingrained, and we see it in scholarship and we see it everywhere else. So some mechanism for greater sensitivity to those polarities and a reconfiguring, I think, of curricular materials and other kinds of materials would be helpful. And then the other question is, how does one combat anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism has not gone away. And how, an understanding of the role that Christian texts have played and concrete measures to counteract that and to accord contemporary Jews and Judaism the kind of respect that I think would be necessary in order to combat that. So I don't have any great fixes on this, but I think there are two areas that really have to be looked at if, for an educational institution like the Greg. One would be curriculum changes, which means not only, in my view, ensuring that Second Temple Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, the Jewish tradition of Parshanut, commentaries on the Hebrew Bible, not only ensuring that those have a bigger place in the curriculum and not as background to Christianity, as Joseph really emphasized yesterday, but they are taught as worthy subjects of inquiry in and of themselves. Modern Judaism people who, students who come here and take courses here, then go back into their own worlds. There may be Jews or there may not be Jews, but if there are, the Jews that they're meeting are not, Matthew and Mark, they are modern Jews who are not the same as New Testament Jews, not the same as biblical Jews. So something around that to understand the phenomenon of contemporary Judaism, in particular contexts. So there's curricular elements, but there's also having more Jews here. There's quite, Massimo mentioned about the interaction, that for some students here, Rabbi Meyer might be the first Jew that they've ever met. And in my own teaching as a Jewish New Testament scholar at universities in Canada, we have many students from small town Ontario, let's say, who also have never met a Jew. And for them, it was really, it's really this eye-opener. First of all, that there are Jews in this world today, which some people don't realize, that Judaism and Jews still exist. And second of all, a Jew that knows something about Christianity. I think it would be good to create more opportunities for more natural sorts of interactions between Jews and Christians in this kind of context.
Thank you very much. Yes, again, there's a lot to think about with what you said. I'm still struck by the Jesus anti-Jewish, that image is staying with me, having been sometimes I'm 66, I have also been at times been anti-Canadian because of some things our government has done. And it doesn't make me not Canadian. Right. It makes me terribly invested in my world when I'm anti-Canadian. But okay, that's just a quick remark. I want to hear Scott.
Very good. Craig, thank you so much. This has been an extraordinary conference. It's been so stimulating. And I'm still also struck by yesterday in Ostia Antica, standing in that ancient synagogue, this beautiful spring day, the sun, beginning of a new season. And it was just wonderful. And I think that was just a real extra blessing to all of the discussions that we're having here. I need more time.
Okay, no,
there's just
I'll cut
so
you
much.
Off
and
after 1 hour, I'll tell you
this reaction to listen to, I want this Christians and Jews, Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, we are listening to you. We are listening. This is so important for us and stimulating in our research as well. So that's my first thing to say. Adele, the two passages from Nostra Aetate, which you chose to comment on, were the very same that I chose. So as I'm listening to you and looking at you, I said, we're on the same wavelength here. Because she has something to say about this, and I have to as well. And also just the very invitation of going back to this book again and opening up the decrees of the council. We must implement Vatican II. We've been saying this for 60 years. We have to be more committed to doing this. And this 3 days together convinces me all the more. The first one that you mentioned, and again, since Christians and Jews have a common spiritual heritage. Spiritual, we need to develop that further, in addition to liturgical and theological, spiritual. This sacred council wishes to do two things: to encourage and to further. Of course, we need to go back to the Latin. To encourage and to further mutual understanding and appreciation. Well, here we are, and that's what we've been doing. So we need to pat ourselves on the back for doing that. We are encouraging one another, and we are furthering this process of mutual appreciation, understanding. How, the council goes on to say, and I think I'm proposing this as kind of like a subtitle for any future conferences, and hopefully there will be, by two means. First of all, by biblical and theological inquiry, which is precisely what we're doing. And I want to insist on both of those adjectives, biblical and theological, both Jewish theology and Christian/Roman Catholic theology. There's more need for that. By means of fraternal or friendly discussions Depends on how we translate that adjective as well. So may we continue this friendly discussion, which is fantastic. So the next thing to say is, Nostra Aetate is relation with the Jews, but this is a profound document of the council. It's an examination of conscience. This is the council reflecting on the mystery of the church. So as a Roman Catholic priest speaking to you and to Protestants here, the Roman Catholic is looking and it's saying, where have we gone wrong? What have we missed? And it's beautiful. And the Sacred Council remembers, a verb that unites Jews and Christians, remembering things, what goes on in the Passover celebration, remembering liberation from slavery in Egypt, what goes on for us with the Eucharist, remembering this liberation that Jesus Christ has brought by our belief in his death and resurrection. Remembering, there is a connection here. The spiritual ties that link, the council says, the people of the new covenant, Christians, and the stock of Abraham, the descendants of Abraham, the chosen people. There it is. And everything that follows the rest of paragraph 4 is about the Jews. To me, there's absolute clarity on that. It's about the Jews. And all of the extraordinary things that God has done in his relationship with his beloved people, his chosen people, which we Christians too often have forgotten. So what a wonderful refresher course that is. And then, of course, commenting on the Jewish Jesus, which, of course, is the main topic of our conference together. And, of course, the Apostle Paul has to make his appearance here at this point. We're in Romans 9. So the last long list of all of the wonderful blessings that God has given to his chosen people. Lastly, the Christ. And this document ends with a quotation from Romans and then adds the Son of the Virgin Mary. And as I was listening to it, I'd say, where's my text? Am I just dreaming that? And it's like, the Son of the Virgin Mary. Then the apostles, within the council describes as the pillars of the church and also of Jewish descent. The apostles, right around the Biblicum 12 Apostoli. The importance of the 12 apostles, there we are, right there. They're important for us Christians, And the council will go on to say that the bishops are the descendants of, of the followers of the apostles, with all of what that means for our ecclesiology. And then the early disciples who proclaimed the gospel of Christ. So there's a connection there. And I'm going to use that for about where do we go from here in light of that. So we're left with the Son of the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary plays an essential role in the history of salvation. We Roman Catholics believe that. The Reformation, the whole question of the Virgin Mary and the saints, 1500s. We know what's going on there. But this is important, and let me point out to all of us, speaking again to the Roman Catholics here to refresh our memory, that this mystery of the church, the mystery of Christ, first of all, there is a Christological aspect to that. Her son Jesus, whom Christians will proclaim as Son of God, as the Anointed One, as the Lord, brings us to Dei Verbum, dogmatic constitution on divine revelation. So that's important. And then the mystery of the church, Lumen Gentium. The final paragraphs of Lumen Gentium bring us to Mary. So by bringing this up, we're talking something profound. Mary, Jesus becomes a human being through the incarnation, thanks to Mary, and becomes a part of the Jewish people, thanks to Mary. So Mary is so important. And the guidelines on religious revelation to the Jews. So these are followed in 1974, and I'm just going to say this out loud. In addition to the friendly talks, we're encouraged to meet and so forth, and doing that. I want to say something more about liturgy. Where was that passage here? Let me get it right now. Jesus was born of the Jewish people, as were his apostles and a large number of his first disciples. There it is. Jesus was born. What else? There it is. We Roman Catholics need to absorb that further and part of the implementation. That's absolutely fantastic. So to continue this, AJ, marvelous. You said so much. It's like too much. I want to respond to everything. There's no time. The importance of good biblical scholarship. This unites us. Absolutely unites us. And we've had so many wonderful examples of that with Bea and Ledio. What a wonderful surprise this has turned out to be. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. It's so extraordinary. Not only we want good biblical scholarship, we want excellent biblical scholarship. We're all committed to that. And that means mastery of Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and all of the great languages and the history and so forth. No supersessionism, no Martianism at any level. The Bible must be understood, both the Old and the New. I love reminding students that in light of the New Covenant, when the church forms what we call our Bible, it doesn't begin with Matthew 1:1. It begins with Genesis 1:1. Yeah. How many Catholics are forgetting that? It begins with the continuity here. The reform of the lectionary. Well, I have news for many of you. The Benedictines have been talking about this for a while. We need to reform the lectionary. Absolutely, not just adding extra comments that no one's going to read. We need to reform it. We desperately need to add more Old Testament texts. We need to correct the pairing because there are like two different things going on. As you know, the Old Testament and the Gospel are together, and the readings from St. Paul are going together. And you gave us an ugly example of how they conflict, and that should be corrected, absolutely. And so understanding all of this more in light of history and tradition, and guess what? That's what we do here in Rome. Another important detail, I've been teaching the first cycle for over 30 years, so I know it. Unlike the system in the United States of America, affected, of course, by Protestants and the Master of Divinity degree, here there's a clear separation between the bachelor's program in theology, which would include biblical studies, but no homiletics. Homiletics is done in the colleges. So it's their responsibility of the formators to form these seminarians to be future preachers of the word. We don't do that. Reform is necessary. Also, AJ, picking up what you're saying, remember of the various crises that the Roman Catholic Church is facing, let's not forget the sexual abuse crisis of the clergy. And we've been talking about this for decades now, and only last year, literally last year, the Gregorian University has added the requirement on safeguarding. So we're finally there. Well, in addition to that, I think somehow we need to add 3 hours about Judaism and preventing anti-Semitism. So this has to be added. That's an aside, very important. So definitely in terms of correct theology, which will lead to correct ministry and correct preaching by all means. Craig, you said it so well. We still have so far to go, absolutely, but let's not forget how far we have come in just a half century. And all of us who live in Rome, a half century, hello, take me back to the Republican era, it's like that's old, what happened in 1950 is not old, sorry, no, it's not old. We are in centuries, right? So that's important too. Give us credit for where we're going. We've got so much more to do, and we're aware of that. Another theme, postmodern world, liquid society. We lived in this transition from the modern world to the postmodern world. Our professors were formed in the modern world, as we've heard examples of that. And now, when I came here 40 years ago, the languages, Roman Catholic exegesis was German and French. The language of our exegesis now is English. Oh, the Protestants, guess what? So a major shift there, and we can no longer assume anything. We've heard examples about that. About the background, because our students are now coming from the developing world who have never met Jews. There you are. So we need to inform them about this and say more. Lastly, where do we go from here? Nostra Aetate and the Rediscovery of the Jewish Jesus, Part 2. There's a lot more that needs to be said. We've skimmed the surface, and that has to include theologians, Christology, liturgy, and so forth. Nostra Aetate and the rediscovery of the Jewish Virgin Mary, that would be something for Roman Catholics to think about Mary. And what I've been thinking about this too, the role of women in worship, not merely the synagogue, but at the home. And, Sabbath meal, Pascha, all of the role of women. What did Mary teach Jesus? Extraordinary. So the Jewish Virgin Mary, the Jewish apostles, the Jewish disciples, to really claim that, and this wonderful balance that comes from Nostra Aetate. And lastly, the soul and the eye. We've been speaking of the mind, the mind, the mind, absolutely magnificent. Worship. There are all kinds of things we have no time to go into of Jewish worship and Christian worship, and you talked about le Deo, Jewish, and we need to somehow appreciate that. And even these texts invite us to pray together. Wouldn't that be magnificent? To hear a passage from Torah and the Psalm and pray together and then be in silence with no images of the saints and so forth. Marvelous. And lastly, the eye. Beautiful. We looked at the synagogue, museums, taking students there, priests, seminarians, whatever. They're immediately struck by the beauty of these works. Oh, the Jews appreciate beauty. Yes, they do. And you bet it. And how moving that is. And the Jews have an experience of the holy. Look at the burning candle before the Torah scrolls. Oh, it's like our tabernacle. Yeah, it's sacred. We need to build on that. So the beauty of these experiences, there's something aesthetic. There's something more about the soul. That's where we need to go as well. Thank you all. I've taken long too.
Thank you. No, that was a great summary of what we've been about these past few days. And I just wanted to react quickly, because I'm very conscious of the time, to what Massimo said. Through some of the funding, we were able to bring a group of students to Krakow to see the vibrant life there, first of all, the vibrant Jewish life, and then also to visit the extermination camps. And just to underscore that, this was an international group. I don't know, was there even a European with us? There wasn't even a European in the group? Ukraine? Yeah, it was a student from Ukraine, yes. But otherwise, it was all the different parts of the continents were represented, and just the impact of that experience, people who have never met a Jew or have had no contact. So I just really encourage people to have that experience. We need to think about it. The time is 5-minute countdown. I would like to kind of shift it a little bit, because we've done a good job, and just announce and have AJ speak for a minute or two of the 3rd edition. And then I would like Adele to speak about a moving book that she is in the process of publishing. Just 2 things, okay? So if you would speak to what's happening and when it's coming out and when we can buy it.
The 3rd edition of the Jewish Annotated New Testament is right now in press. It is due out from Oxford University Press in English in the beginning of 2026. We have added on at least 11 new essays, including essays on sin and atonement, in terms of the New Testament in light of Jewish material at the time and subsequently. We have an essay on the land. We have an essay on supersessionism. We have an essay on the Targums, because we thought that was...
You didn't ask me to write it.
No, if you convert to Judaism, we might.
I'm not going to say anything.
You're fine.
No.
And the annotations are substantially revised in part toward more practical concerns. How should this material be preached in churches? How should this material be taught to children, in adult catechetical material, and so on? So the work will be user-friendly. And just to go back to Craig's point about the Dutch translation of the Jewish Annotated was published this November. And in the weird way the world works, I was in Holland for the book launch at the same time when there were anti-Semitic riots happening in Amsterdam. And the good thing was, I said to my sponsors, "Do you want to cancel this because it's a little dangerous?" And they said, no, we will protect you, we the Dutch Bible Society. And they did, and people came out in massive numbers to celebrate this book. So at the same time that anti-Semitic riots are happening in Amsterdam, there were Christians, Protestants, and Catholics, including the Catholic bishop and members of I think the Lutheran bishop too, was there to celebrate the launch of this book in Haarlem and Utrecht. So good news is happening.
Great, thank you. We look forward to that. Go ahead, please.
Just to say that
A microphone.
sorry, the second edition has been translated also into Italian, so another good news.
And just to underscore what you said, just repeat it. It's just really this is a text which is growing and maturing, and so it's really trying to get to the audience you want to reach. So take your time. I'd like to hear the story of your upcoming book. Get ready.
Okay, so the background is that my parents were both Holocaust survivors. So in the new language, I used to be called a child of survivors. Now apparently I'm called a second generation Holocaust survivor, in the understanding about the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next. I was born not long after my parents came to Canada in the aftermath of World War II. My parents always spoke openly about this. My mother was a Yiddish educator and also in Toronto, and she spoke very often to high schools, to church groups, and about her own experience. And she was very articulate and had a tremendous presence, and so she had a lot of impact. She died in 2021 of COVID, during the COVID era, one of the most difficult experiences, and I know many other people had that as well, of the restrictions that made mourning very complicated. And then it fell to my brother and myself to clear out her apartment. And I was in charge of all the paperwork. So boxes and boxes of papers that we put in the car and drove back to Ottawa and worked through them. And of course, phone bills and taxes, from 1972 and, all kinds of things. And among them, a box of Yiddish documents that my mother had brought with her in 1951 when she came to Canada. And I'm looking through these documents, and there are all kinds of, interesting things, articles that she had published in the immediate post-war period, and postcards and all kinds of things. And then I came across some pages written in Yiddish, which had dated entries, May 1940 to August of 1944, from the Lodz ghetto, the ghetto in Łódź, which is where my mother was from 1940 until 1944. And I thought, this is very strange, because my mother had always said that she kept a diary. Just about every teenage girl in the ghetto, in any ghetto, kept a diary, but she lost it when she was deported to Auschwitz in August of 44. So I wasn't sure what this was, and it was just loose pages. And then as I went further through these documents, I found the good copy of those pages put together in a school notebook of about 70 pages in handwritten Yiddish. And there was a front cover that said Chanele's Togbuch, which means the diary of Chanele. My mother was not Chanele. Chanele was her best friend in the ghetto. And they were extremely close in the way that those of us that were teenage girls, many of us have had that experience. So it said Chanele's Togbuch, and then a little kind of epigraph addressed to Chanele, saying that, well, this is done in loving memory of Chanele Heuser, these were her dates, and then saying to Chanele, I knew that you didn't survive. But after the war, I went back to the building where you lived in the Lodz ghetto, and I found these pages, and I'm transcribing them. So this was immediately puzzling to me, because I knew that my mother had not gone back to Poland until we went back as a family in 2003. So, of course, regretting terribly that I didn't know about this during the time that my mother was alive, because she could have answered all these questions. But I didn't know about it. She had never talked to me about that particular document. So what I've done is I've translated the document from Yiddish into English and added annotations matching up the events that are mentioned and the dates and so on with the historical record, which is quite well documented for the ghetto. And I'm publishing this with Yale University Press with some essays that contextualize this document in the context of ghetto diaries and memoirs. Now, what is fascinating about it is at the end she repeats that story. So the diary itself, the first 25 pages or so, are really about Hanala and her family. She was a real person. We have other documentation. I was able to visit the building where Hanala lived and where my mother lived and kind of walk that route, which she talks about so often in the diary. And then the rest of it is about the friendship between Hanala and a girl named Rivka, who's really my mother. And through that, I recognized some of the stories that my mother had told and that she wrote about in her own memoir. And so I think this was really my mother's way of, she wrote this, I think, in 1946 or 1947, after she was in a DP camp after liberation, and then ended up in Brussels for a few years. And that's where she wrote it. She was 20 years old at the time that she wrote this. It was her way, first of all, of mourning her friend, but also of starting to come to terms with her own ghetto experience. And for me, it's been a real privilege. You know, who gets access to their mother's minds when their moms were teenagers? You know, to really see how she was trying to process this.
So we all look forward to the publication. You can be assured you're going to get at least 30 copies sold very quickly. Yeah, no, we really look forward to that. That's a marvelous work. Time?
Well, Hanala's diary, and then some sort of subtitle. And it should also be out maybe towards the end of 2026.
2026,
Yeah.
Terrific. Time's up. Massimo has turned to me, I have to say a few words of thanks. This event was born of an email from Adele to me saying, I'm going to be in Rome, do you want to do something for Nostra Aetate in February? And I said, sure, you do something, I'll do something, and it'll be an evening and we'll take everyone out to dinner. And then Peter came to me, President Dubovsky came to me in June and said, look, we got a little money, why don't we do something more? And I was really figuring that Massimo had something up his sleeve for the big event, and you graciously allowed us to do this, even though there'll be another more important event and at the actual date of Nostra Aetate. So this is how it happened. And I am very grateful to you, Massimo. It is so easy working as a team. You bounce things off. Will this work? Can this function? Do you think we can get to that? Ostia Antica, can you predict the rain? Yeah. And then you've got Paola at the Biblicum, and you've got Federica in Cardinal Bea. These two persons just, oh no, we'll the buses, yeah, we'll get that. No. So I was able with Massimo to just say, let's see, oh yeah, though we can get these things to come into the center, and yeah, we don't have to walk that far, and I'm very grateful to Federica and Paola. They've been around. They have really. And then there are people who support us. We have Roberto at the back, making sure that everything is making all this go. Yesterday, Carlo Valentino and Luca. And there are all kinds of other people who have been serving us on coffee breaks and taxi drivers and hotels that make this all go. And I am eternally grateful, really, to them, especially to the dialogue with Massimo, and then finally the speakers. You believe it or not, I'm probably one of the few priests who doesn't like to travel. So, now you have to go home, you've got to go to the airport, you've got to deal with what I call hurry up and wait, and jet lag, and all of these other things that are part of coming to a conference. So to those who took the time to write a paper, to think through this question that we tossed out to them, And now you depart and go on your way. Massimo and I are very, very grateful that you took the time to come to us to share these insights, and I hope, as Scott said, that there will be Nostra Aetate 2 in October, and then a continuing discussion of how to move this forward in the future for the mission of, for us here at the Gregorian, the mission of the Church, but the word of our society, the world of our society, that we break through issues of racism and hatred that touch us with this particular question, but then as a much broader question in our world today. Who is the other, capital O, in our lives, and how can we respect, love, and discover the other, if I might borrow from the great Carmelite Saint Edith Stein. So again, finally, thanks to you, because if you didn't come, we would just be talking to ourselves, and we don't want to be talking to ourselves. We want to be talking with other people. So I'm very grateful to those who took the time. And it's now 12:37. We're 7 minutes over. So thank you for that extra time. Okay? Okay.